They said it all began as a game, but no one ever asked, who spoke the rules first? The Night Tellers. At night, the city sounded different. The streets below the hills seemed to hold their breath, quieting themselves. And at the top, where an old water tower once stood, children would gather, not every night. Only when the sky was clear and the stars burned bright. They'd sit in a circle, as if around a campfire, though there was no flame, just phone flashlights and bursts of laughter. Someone would bring a blanket, someone chips, someone stories. They called it the Night Circle. The rule was simple: tell only what's made up. Only what never happened. That, they said, was why the stories could come alive. Adults thought it was a game, strange but maybe even useful. Good for the imagination, they said. Builds friendship. No one quite remembered where the rules came from. Who first said, if you tell your story under the stars, it will eventually find its way into reality? Nico was the youngest. He had just turned 9. He spoke little but listened with such intensity that even the older kids would fall silent when he raised his head. That night, for the first time, he decided to speak. His voice was quiet, and not everyone caught the words. Only the final sentence remained in their memory. And then he left, and no one ever saw him again, because he wasn't afraid. 3 days later, Nico didn't show up to school. They searched parks, basements, his grandmother's house. The police questioned friends, canvassed neighbors, issued alerts. His parents were frantic. They said maybe he'd gone to his biological father, but he was overseas. The cameras showed nothing, as if the boy had simply vanished, dissolved between chapters. Everyone called it a tragedy, an accident perhaps, a runaway. Only the librarian, Alain, while crossing Nico's name off the visitor list, remembered that night, and the phrase the boy had spoken beneath the stars. He didn't know why, but he wrote it down in his notebook, then stared at it for a long time and couldn't bring himself to cross it out. Alain was not a superstitious man. He believed in statistics, in precise cataloging systems, in the silence between bookshelves. It was what he loved about his job. Everything had its place. Even the children's section, chaotic and full of torn pages, eventually succumbed to order. Books were returned, names logged, order restored. Always. But after Nico's disappearance, something in that order seemed to waver. He remembered how the boy used to come into the library, always alone. He'd take off his shoes even if no one asked. He never spoke unless spoken to, just walked along the shelves, selecting books by some private system. He read quickly, sometimes incompletely, but returned them in exact sequence. He always sat by the window, second sill from the left, and murmured to himself, as if filtering the words through his own breath. Sometimes, returning a book, he would just look at Alain and nod silently. Once, Alain asked why he read such strange stories. "Because they don't know how they'll end yet," Nico replied. That day, sorting returned books, Alain noticed one, Voices That Don't Sleep, with a torn cover and an odd bookmark inside. It wasn't a real bookmark, but a note folded in 4, on gray paper with no date. If this story comes alive, don't be afraid. It's already here. Alain recognized the handwriting. Nico had a habit of printing his letters, slightly slanted. It was in his library registration form. He slipped the note back in, but felt the book grow heavier in his hands. The following week, he began rereading the circulation logs. Names, dates, books checked out. That's when he noticed the pattern. For 2 months before his disappearance, Nico had only borrowed collections of fairy tales, but not ordinary ones, those without authors, brought from somewhere, translated, reprinted. Some weren't even in the official catalog. Alain started placing them on a separate shelf, 22 books. Nearly everyone had underlined phrases, sometimes strange symbols. In one, a drawing of a black dog with wings. In another, the phrase, "The fire began with breath." In a third, a line, "The clock stopped at 2:46. And he remembered, a month ago, there had been a fire on the edge of the city. A week ago, a girl had said in panic she'd seen a flying dog. And the clock in his own office, had stopped on the very day Nico vanished. He walked to the window. Evening was settling over the city in soft blue. Alain didn't know what he was beginning to believe, but he already knew where to start looking. It wasn't on the shelf, but behind it. Alain was looking for a book requested by a student, another volume from the series about traveling animals. He reached for a dusty tome and noticed something hidden behind it. A paper spine with no title, faded and uneven, as if it had been long forgotten, or meant to be. He pulled it out gently as though afraid of disturbing something asleep. It was a notebook, ordinary school type, spiral bound, with a marbled cover. No author, no date, no title. Inside, handwritten stories, each signed with a child's name and a date, sometimes going back years. The sentences were messy, often without punctuation, as if dictated in a hurry. And then he said, "If you forget me, I'll become air, and no one will remember how morning smelled." Maya, 2003. She hid inside the mirror and now everything is backwards. But mom doesn't see. Ellie, 2007. I had a brother, but now I don't, but he was real. Thomas, 2011. Some entries were crossed out. One of them Alain read despite the strokes over the letters. He was a hero until he said it out loud. Now no one remembers who he was. Name erased. He paused over this one. It trembled inside him like a tightly strung thread. A story with a flaw, or one that didn't want to be heard. On another page, an entry inside a circle. She told it too early. He wasn't born yet to hear it. Mylene, 1996. And in the margin, someone had added in a different hand, "A story comes to life if someone believes in it the moment it's needed." Alain turned the page and froze. He always listened to other people's stories until one day he heard his own. Alain, no date. His chest tightened. It wasn't just a name, it was a feeling, recognition, as if someone had looked through him and named what he'd always been afraid to say. Since childhood, he had felt that his life was a draft, as if someone were writing it from a distance, never quite finishing. He had never shared that thought, not with his parents, not with his few friends. Only sometimes, silently, he'd ask himself, why does everything around me feel just slightly borrowed? He placed the notebook on his desk and sat in silence for a long time, as if testing whether the building was still breathing. How many years had it been lying there? Why him? Who had written it? He looked out the window. The sunset brushed the rooftops. Somewhere out there, the children were already gathering, and someone perhaps was beginning to tell a story. He walked without a flashlight. Only the moon lit the grass beneath his feet and the wet bark of trees. The hill felt closer than usual. Or maybe he was just moving faster. In his mind, something kept knocking. What will you say if they ask why you came? He didn't know. Did he want to stop them, understand them, or simply hear again what he'd once heard in childhood and never quite forgotten? When Alain reached the top, the children were already seated in a circle. 7 of them. Some wore hoodies, one had a pom-pom hat. Phones lay in the center like a fireless campfire. The dim glow caught glimpses of socks, elbows, ears. No one laughed. That surprised him most. He took a step, then froze. Watch. Or speak. "What are you doing?" he asked at last. His voice came out softer than he expected. They turned to him but didn't flinch, as if they'd been waiting. "Tonight he'll tell a story," said a girl in a yellow coat. "The new boy. We don't know where he's from. He just came." Alain looked to where she nodded. Sitting beside her was a boy, his face in shadow, hair dark, eyes like drops of glass. He didn't seem a stranger, but wasn't familiar either. "What's your name?" Alain asked. The boy raised his gaze as if remembering he was supposed to answer. "It doesn't matter," he said. "The story does." He spoke clearly, slowly, almost without emotion. His tale was strange, not scary, not funny. It was about a man with a book who listened to others' stories and one day vanished at the end of his own. He didn't die, didn't run. He simply dissolved, like a line no one reads anymore. Alain held his breath. Part of him wanted to stop the story, Another part needed to hear the end. He knew something had already begun, or continued. When the boy fell silent, the circle stayed still. No applause, no questions. Then someone stood, someone yawned, someone turned off their light. They left in silence, as if waking from a dream. Alain remained. The boy was gone. He circled the hill. No prints, no sounds, no breath in the grass. He wanted to ask, "What did you mean, dissolved?" But another voice echoed in his head. "Stories come true," whispered the same girl in the coat as she passed him. "If someone really lives in them." She paused, then added almost inaudibly, "But not all do, only the ones that want something in return." On the ground lay a notebook, the marbled one, with a torn corner. And on the first page, a new entry. And he heard himself in someone else's words, and knew it was time to end. No name. At first, Alain thought he was simply tired. He'd been thinking too much, sleeping too little. That's how he explained the street he didn't recognize. It led from the pharmacy to the old market and seemed like it had always been there. Except the pharmacist couldn't remember what it was called. "Just a road," he shrugged. "We don't name everything, right?" But Alain knew it had been named. He checked the city's archive maps. No street with that curve existed in any edition. Not on paper, not in the digital database. Then the shop appeared, a postcard and frame store. It stood on the corner where a newspaper stand used to be. The saleswoman smiled confidently. "You again. You liked the Fox postcards. Took 2 last week." "I don't remember," Alain said. "That's all right," she replied. "Memory likes to play hide and seek, especially with those who are hiding themselves." He left without buying anything, but with the uneasy sense he'd missed something important. He tried recalling the name of his library colleague, the young one with the ring on a chain. He could picture her, but the name wouldn't come. And suddenly he realized he couldn't remember his first book, the one he'd read to pieces, the one that had perhaps made him a librarian in the first place. The title slipped away like a word in a dream. The city began whispering to itself. Familiar faces changed surnames. Old buildings got fresh coats of paint no one had ordered. Memory became a shared negotiation, and only he noticed the cracks. In the library, the books began behaving strangely. Some vanished from shelves. Others returned with blank pages. In one of them, the very one with Nico's note, the text had disappeared. Only the cover remained, in emptiness within. Alain ran a finger across the paper and felt warmth, as if the words still lived, but no longer for him. He went to the edge of town, to the house where old Greta lived. People spoke of her in many ways: keeper, witch, madwoman. But Alain knew she didn't read with her eyes. She read with her fingers. And she remembered not years, but rhythms. She greeted him in silence, as if she'd been expecting him. "You're starting to see," she said at last. "It always hurts." "What is this? What's changing?" "Not what," she said, straightening her back. "Who?" "You think reality shapes stories, but sometimes it's the other way around." He stayed quiet. "Maybe you're not a story," she said after a pause. "Maybe you're just carrying someone else's." He looked up. "Isn't that the same thing?" "Number those who carry one can still come back." He didn't know whether to feel hope in that, or only delay. She handed him a key, old, heavy, with letters too worn to read. "No, it's yours. When you're ready, you'll open it." At night, the library echoed with a dull hush, as if the walls absorbed sound instead of returning it. Alain stood by the locked archive door, the key heavy in his hand. He didn't know why he'd come now, after speaking with Greta, after the city had begun to feel not written but rewritten. The key slid into the lock smoothly. A click. Silence stretched, like breath before a word. He lit the desk lamp. The room was empty. Shelves, dust, stacks of catalogs. But in the far corner stood a drawer he'd never noticed before. The same one, holding the marbled notebook. Only now there were more. Dozens. All identical. He opened the first he touched. No name, no date on the cover. Inside, the same handwriting. "Once there was a girl who went too far and came back someone else." He built a house of words, but no one wanted to live in it. If a story is abandoned too long, it gets hungry. Alan turned pages, but his hands slowed. Something in him resisted. He opened another notebook, and halfway through, he found a familiar line. Once there was a boy who listened to others' stories until he found his own. He froze. It was the very same story. The first. But now it had a continuation he hadn't seen before. And he realized he'd never been alive until someone spoke him for real. He ran his fingers over the words. The paper trembled slightly, like skin or breath. On the last page, nothing. Only faint pencil lines, like someone had started to write, then erased it. He sat down, stared at the blank page, thought. Maybe we're not heroes, he thought. We're marginal notes. We're the ones who fill in the missing words so the story can finally end. He slowly reached forward, tried to tear the page out, but it wouldn't budge, as if it knew its time hadn't come or had just arrived. If I don't write, I won't exist. But if I do, I won't be someone else again. He exhaled and began to write, slowly, like remembering. Not inventing, remembering. He was a librarian. He believed in order, until one day he learned he was part of a story. He didn't want to vanish. He wanted to end properly. He placed a period, thought and removed it, then wrote, and if someone ever finds this story, let them tell it. Only at night, only beneath the stars. Then it will continue. He looked at the words and felt no relief, only a strange silence. He didn't want to disappear, but maybe long ago someone left an empty space here. For him. The morning was transparent, as if the city had forgotten what shadows looked like. Birds sang too clearly, leaving no space between their notes. The library opened on time, as always, but the key turned in the door by the assistant. Alain was gone. In his office, everything was in place. Chair tucked in, lamp switched off, books neatly aligned. Only on the desk lay a notebook, marbled, blank cover, and a note inside. Stories don't disappear. They're just waiting to be told again. Greta once said, some stories leave without saying goodbye, but if you listen closely, you can still hear them rustle between the lines. On the hill, amid morning wind and dew-wet grass, lay a flashlight. Beside it, footprints leading nowhere. Neither Alain nor the boy with the notebook was ever seen again. No one knew the name of the one who told the last story, and no one was certain he'd ever existed. But the children began to gather again, cautiously in whispers. No circles, no phones. Someone would simply sit on the grass and begin to tell a story. Sometimes to themselves, sometimes to the sky. And one day a girl of about 8 climbed the hill alone. She held an old book with torn pages and had a voice not yet touched by fear. She looked at those sitting and spoke. There once was a man, she said, who didn't know he was a story, and still he wanted to be real, even if that meant disappearing. She fell silent. The wind touched the grass. Someone might have sat beside her, or stood, or simply listened. A camera, had there been one, would have captured only her face, serious, almost adult, and her gaze, not at the viewer, but through them. In it was the same quiet resolve with which Nico had once spoken. He told me I should continue, she whispered, and in that moment, the world held its breath, as if preparing to remember something new, or someone.